Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. My name is Yulia Joja. I am Director and Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe Initiative, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event on the grain war and global food crisis from the Black Sea to the Middle East. MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative explores interactions between Middle East countries and their Frontier Europe neighbors, the parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, which form a frontier between Western Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. The program examines the growing energy, trade, security, and political relationships with the aim of developing greater understanding of the interplay between these strategically important regions. Today's topic is a difficult one. Russia's war against Ukraine is the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II, with about 15 million people that have been displaced and thousands of civilian casualties. Russia has waged a war of destruction, not just against Ukraine, but also against the world. For months, Moscow has prevented the export of Ukrainian grain and other food supplies that countries in the Middle East, in Africa, and in other places depend on. Half of the world's food program comes from Ukraine, meaning that the Russian blockade of the Black Sea region has affected international humanitarian relief efforts. The devastating consequences of food shortages and increased prices are being felt around the world, leading to a heightened risk of famine in the months that are coming. Some of the questions that we'll be discussing today with our distinguished panelists are about how Russia is waging this grain war in the Black Sea region, how food shortages are impacting Middle East countries that depend on Ukrainian grain, what role the Crimean Peninsula specifically has in Russia's blockade, and what the international community can do to ease the food crisis and prevent a major war. I'm honored to be joined today by three distinguished panelists, Miret Mabruk, who is our MEI's Senior Fellow and Founding Director of the Egypt Program, Tamila Tasheva, who is joining us visiting from Ukraine and who's the permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in Crimea, and Maria Tomak, last but not least, also from Ukraine, coordinator of the Media Initiative for Human Rights in Ukraine. To read their full bios, please visit MEI's website. I look forward to taking audience questions this time through Zoom's Q&A feature in our hybrid format today. The feature you can find all on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu or tweeting us at MEI. If you have technical issues, again, please email events@mei.edu and we'll do our best to help. And with that, I'd like to just get into our conversation today and perhaps start this time narrow with the Crimean Peninsula. We know it's been illegally annexed now for 8 years. But we also know that it plays a special role when it comes to Russia's blockade, how much they can physically block in the Black Sea when it comes to grain exports, and not only, but we also know that Russia's aggression when it comes to specifically food crisis is not just grain, but there's many aspects of it. There's stealing, there's also burning of fields and the blockade itself. So I'm turning to you, Tamila, to give us perhaps an overview of the Crimean Peninsula and what role it plays and what you are monitoring in terms of human rights violations, war crimes related to now the grain export and the food crisis when we're looking at Crimea. And then we'll broaden the conversation to the wider regions of the Black Sea and the Middle East. Tamila, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for these events and for Middle East Institute. For us, it's very important. Actually, we have a 1 week advocacy trip to US. We have a communication in UN, in DC, and communicate issues and highlight issues according to Crimea after 24th of February, after full-scale invasion, because of course war is not started just now, a few months ago, but started 8 years ago with occupation of Crimea, and how is Russian Federation make from Crimea a huge military base, and a base for occupying new territories in Kherson region and Zaporizhia region, and how we see how they use this Crimea to full-scale invasion against Ukraine. I have a little speech, if I may, a statement from our side, from a mission of the president about food security and how Crimea is used by Russians to stolen grain, and how they transport this grain to another regions. Actually, really, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and until February 24, Ukraine played an important role in ensuring the food security of its partners in the Middle East, Southern Asia, and North Africa. The aspect was lost during the new active phase of Russian aggression, when occupying forces started looting the food stock of the grain and transferring them to the temporarily occupied Crimea. From there, the stolen grain is delivered by cargo ships under the Russian flag to the Russian Federation or the Middle East, Turkey, and Syria. In the temporarily occupied territories in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, about 1.5 million tons of grain were stored in farm stocks. Illegal export of several 100,000 tons is already confirmed. In order to increase the intensity in the illegal export of grain, the Crimea occupying administration decided to expand Jankoy, Perekop, and Armyansk checkpoints on the administrative line between Crimea and the Kherson region. In the total, 11 additional lines for traffic appeared. The export of grain from Crimea is carried out by ships mostly under the Russians or Syrian flag. Such ships are already heading to from the Russian ports Kavkaz, but in the Kerch Strait, they turn off the radars and in fact enter the closed seaports in Crimea and Sevastopol. According to public data, as of the second half of June, Ukrainian experts have identified the following dry cargo ships that illegally export Ukrainian grain from Crimea. It's Matros Koshka, it's near 54,000 tons of grain. Matros Poznich, it's 81,000 tons of grain. Mikhail Ninashev, it's 82,000 tons of grain. Finikia, more than 48,000 tons of grain. Vera, it's 6,000 tons of grain. Nadezhda, more than 11,000 tons of grain. And another ships, Smorovsky, 48, Sauria, Fodor, and St. Nikolai. Thus, the Russian Federation established a sales channel via occupied Sevastopol. Particularly, all the ships that leave Sevastopol carry stolen Ukrainian grain. In most cases, the Russian port Kavkaz is indicated in the in the port documents. In May, export throughout the Kafkas port were equivalent of 28 of total grain export from Russia to about 11 in the previous 4 years. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine emphasized that the devastation of captured areas in Kherson region, the looting of grain and agricultural machinery from there undermines not only the food security of Ukraine, but also regions in the world that depend on Ukrainian food. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine warns that the grain shipments of the Russian Federation may contain stolen grain, and that any country that knowledgeably buys the grain is complicit in this crime. Currently, Ukraine collect evidence. Given the war situation, it's very difficult to prove that this particular grain was exported from the occupied territories. But on the other hand, the status of this grain is clearly defined as a contraband since after the occupation of Crimea in 2014. The Ukrainian authorities have closed the ports of the temporarily occupied Crimea. The ambassador of Ukraine to the Republic of Turkey, Vasil Bondar, noted that in the situation with the grain, there are at least 3 crimes. The theft, the illegal use of Ukrainian closed ports, and the export of this grain under falsified documents. Those crimes are already investigated by Ukrainian law enforcement. The Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine is actually investigated the possibility war crimes aside from the illegal use of Ukrainian closed seaports. The Ukrainian Prosecutor General requests international legal assistance from Turkey. As a result of the described situation, the following negative consequences are expected: violation of integral supply chains of agricultural and food products, eruption of the sowing campaigns, which is especially treatment gives a high world price for gas and other facilities. Active hostilities are currently taking place in those regions where most of the wheat grown, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Zaporizhia. This will lead to this decrease in yield collection and export of grain, complicit export of Ukrainian products to foreign markets due to blocking of Ukrainian ports by the Russian Federation. It's near 60% of Ukrainian agricultural products are exported by the sea, and due to the complicity of the demand processes to resumption of grain cultivation in Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Zaporizhia regions may take more than 1 year. This turn will lead to a future difficult of agricultural products. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamila, for this overview. And you have basically in detail already answered a question that we already have from Adnan Faraj on Russia's transportation of Ukrainian grain as illegal in terms of evidence, along with what Tamila provided as initial evidence. There's also journalistic investigations and proof. I can recommend an investigation that was done a few weeks ago by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the office in Ukraine, that provided satellite imagery of ships that were going through the Bosphorus Canal into the Eastern Mediterranean with stolen grain from Ukraine. And I believe there's many more out there, but thank you for the question. He's already thanking us. Thank you too. And let me turn to you, Maria, to give us an overview, zooming a little bit out of Crimea, but into southern Ukraine. We've seen in the first few months of war, unfortunately, Russia making gains, territorial gains, and the consequences of that are seen not just in military terms and an impact on civilian lives, but also in terms of food supplies and food production. So can you give us this overview in terms of what the situation looks like right now and what you are evaluating as the most important challenges as we're looking ahead through this already half through the summer with an impact on Ukraine and the larger region?
Thank you so much, and thank you also for organizing this event and bringing attention to this important issue. So just to clarify, I represented indeed before January of this year the Media Initiative for Human Rights, but now I shifted to the mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea. Therefore, I represent kind of the government, just to make it clear. So I think it's really important to understand, and why we actually also cooperating with you on this important event, is that this food crisis is also interlinked with the attempt of Russian Federation to manipulate informationally and to kind of prove falsely that it's Ukraine is guilty for this food crisis, which is obviously non-truth. And we can see these attempts of manipulation, informational, like this propaganda, especially in the regions where, which are dependent to the big extent on these food supplies from Crimea, from Ukraine, sorry. I mean, Middle East and African countries. Unfortunately, we don't monitor closely. We have no kind of capacity to do this monitoring separately in those regions, but that's the vibe that we get and the signals that we get from expert community, for instance, that it's Ukraine whose fault is this food crisis, or even the US, surprisingly.
Usually everything is US's fault, right?
Exactly, but not the Russian Federation. So therefore, for us, it's important to make it clear what causes this crisis, and it's unfortunately is the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And why it's important also to point out the role of Crimea here, it's because the fact that Russia seized Crimea 8 years ago, and the fact that Russia militarized the peninsula for all these years. Russia built this infrastructure. Russia supplied Crimea with weapons and with personnel, military personnel, and it does it still right now, provided them with this springboard for the very intensive and large-scale aggression and offensive in the southern Ukraine and southeastern Ukraine, which is a breadbasket for lots of the low-income countries in other regions. So therefore, now actually we face the situation when Russia used Crimean resources in order to make this occupation very fast and efficient, basically. So it's not only about this attack, but about the infrastructure that created by Russia in order to seize this territory. And that's what gives them possibility actually to block the seaports, the Ukrainian seaports. And now actually only 3 seaports are, at least it was prior to the liberation of the Snake Island, were available on the Danube for this grain export, but it's just a minor part, like about 90% of the export came from the other Black Sea ports, like Odessa, Mykolaiv mostly, and they're blocked currently. So, and also, of course, they are doing just, these brutal things with agricultural techniques, with even burning the harvest. That's what we see also on the videos, on the footage taken in the field when the harvest is just being burned. or with harvest being stolen, as was described basically by Tamila. And here we have also this critical role of Crimea, which is used as a very convenient base, gray zone, basically, for looting this grain, for falsifying the documents. And I think also it was, thank you for reminding us about that investigation. I think one more important material was published by Financial Times quite recently on this same matter. So I think it's pretty clear that here we have that just most of those exports of grain that comes from Russian Federation may contain or may just fully be like Ukrainian grain, not the Russian ones. And I think it's also may give Russia the possibility to promote itself, like by providing the stolen grain to third countries, by promoting themselves as a very generous provider of the foods to the Middle East countries or to the African countries, and present itself in this capacity. And now I would just point out that there were some negotiation process taking place recently on these days, including Ukrainian side, Russian side, Turkey and the UN, but we are not authorized to comment on it, and that it's still not set in stone what is going to be decided there. So unfortunately, we cannot comment on that, but and hopefully somehow it will be resolved. But I just want to say that it's really important to understand that until Russia is waging this war, until Ukrainian territories remain under the occupation and under the rocket attacks of Russia, it won't be safe. We cannot be sure that we will not face another food crisis. And I think now in this very dramatic and sad way, we can feel the consequences of this Russian aggressive behavior, Russian war on the whole world, basically. It's not only a problem of Ukraine, it's not only a problem of the West, because literally Russia can reach the European countries with their rockets as it reaches from Crimea, including from the ships that are in Crimea, located in Black Sea region. But we have to face lots of consequences, including these food security issues and breaking this chain of food supply throughout the whole world. And I think it's important just to understand what is the source. And I'm telling this not because I represent the government, but because it's so clear, and it's also proved by the independent observers and media that are publishing all those investigations that show us what's the root cause of the problem.
Thank you for this. And you, again, sort of in the limit that you can, answered a question from Madeleine on Turkey mediating the shipping of Ukrainian grain. Again, we're still in the middle of the process of negotiation, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that this will be resolved. But it has been a problematic negotiation, also from the side of Ukraine leaking to the media that their position is not being represented as well as it should be in these negotiations, but also the fact, and this is part of Madeleine's question, of the role of the West in this. We've seen President Biden at the NATO summit recently congratulate President Erdogan for the efforts he's made. We all keep our fingers crossed that this will be working. But as you suggested, Maria, we have no certainty that this can be resolved in any way this summer or the next. And so the consequences of that are already felt and I'm afraid can get worse through the summer and through next year. And so this is a good segue to turn to Miret. I will ask you a bit later about the regional implications and what the voices in the larger region are saying, but I want to focus first on Egypt, your main connection, because Egypt is one of the major economies in the region, but is also highly dependent on grain imports from both Ukraine and Russia, and is now facing a difficult situation that to some extent is reflective of, or sometimes it gets even worse in other countries, but is reflective of the challenges that that countries are going through in the developing world, whether we're talking about Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, to some extent Latin America too. So you've been writing a lot about this, you've been monitoring the situation over the last few months, you knew what's coming. So tell us a little bit about kind of your reads from the ground, what the main issues are and what you're fearing most when we're looking at this food crisis in terms of it turning into potentially famine in Egypt and beyond.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for asking me to come on. So the situation in Egypt is highly uncomfortable, but again, you said we'll go to the region afterwards, but there are places in the region that are going to be significantly worse off, and places in Africa that are going to be significantly worse off as well, where the situation is extremely serious. So in Egypt, Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer. I mean, Egypt still buys wheat through old-fashioned tenders, but the size of that tender the size of that tender moves into global wheat prices. About 50% of Egypt's wheat used to come from Russia and about 30% from Ukraine. So during the run-up, I think the Egyptian government could see what was happening and was scrambling, trying to secure other sources of grain. And at the beginning, they said that they had about 9 months supply of grain. Okay, and this is wheat, not all grain, it's wheat, because there are other issues associated with this.
I'll ask you about corn too, yes.
Corn, okay, and this is with wheat. Now, the problem is as follows. Wheat goes into making bread, and bread is highly subsidized in Egypt. Now, after the 2016 loan from the IMF, the Egyptian government embarked on a seriously strenuous and fairly aggressive reform program, and that reform program included slashing or removing most subsidies in a short period of time. The subsidy that wasn't touched was the bread subsidy. Bread is peculiarly sensitive in Egypt in that, I mean, 29.6% of the population lives below the poverty line. And that bread can very often make the difference between you going to bed hungry or not. Okay. And about 2/3, almost 70 million of Egypt's population are entitled to that subsidized bread. Okay. And it makes a difference. And it is so sensitive that the price of bread in Egypt, the price of subsidized bread in Egypt hasn't changed in about almost 35 years. Okay, it hasn't. The last time they tried to up the prices was in 1977, and what happened was 2 years of rioting, which were known as the Red Riots, before the government, walked back their decision. So when this happened, the government, first of all, attempted to find different sources. But the problem with that is as follows. When as with everything else, it's a matter of supply and demand. And when the invasion happened, wheat prices shot up. So the Egyptians were trying to buy wheat from other places, and everyone put their prices up. So it's not a surprise. And since the price of this comes out of the budget, that shot the budget up, pushing Egypt further into debt. Okay, so that's one. And then the Egyptian government turned to domestic sources. Now, Egypt used to be known as the breadbasket of the world. It has been for a long time. And one of the reasons for that is that wheat is a water-intensive crop, and Egypt doesn't have water. Egypt doesn't have water, and therefore, it's fine importing. So, and what the Egyptian government used to do was set a price, okay, for it to buy wheat from domestic producers so that they would sell the price. The problem was not enough of a supply, and because transporting wheat suddenly became extremely expensive, then it became more lucrative for domestic suppliers to sell their supply to private buyers. So, I mean, you can see where all of this is going. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that the war exacerbated the prices. It's in the middle of already raging inflation, not peculiar to Egypt. It's throughout the world coming on. And again, big problem is that what you're looking at is a knock-on effect. You had 2.5 years of pandemic, and then you had this war. So food prices have gone up, fuel prices have gone up, fertilizer prices have gone up. Okay? And for countries that are mostly agrarian, Egypt is actually an agrarian society. About 30% of the population is involved directly in agriculture. It's about 60% if you look at people who are involved indirectly in agriculture, whether you produce it or make tomato sauce. Okay, so prices keep shooting up, and it is a very, very, very serious issue, and that's just the wheat.
And what about the others?
So
just to stay on
this
the,
is so I think people have been talking about wheat, but in Egypt you also need to take a look at corn. Corn is essential to just about all protein production in Egypt, whether it's livestock or whether it's chickens. So you're looking at dairy, you're looking at beef, you're looking at lamb and all meat production, including chickens and eggs. And in Egypt, as with many countries, what you eat is decided by how much you make. So if you have the money, then you buy meat. You don't have that, then you buy chicken. You don't have that, you buy eggs. You don't have that, you buy cheese, and so on and so on. So all of those are involved in corn. And unlike wheat, corn isn't subsidized by the government and isn't run by the government. It's completely through the private market. So again, you can see, what's happening with that. And what that means is price of corn goes up, price of meat goes up, price of eggs go up. Okay. And it's just been extremely difficult for everybody. And the longer it spins out, the more problematic it's likely to become, in that it chips away at the government, any government's ability to deal with an existing situation if it continues to exacerbate.
That's a dark situation that you're illustrating in a sort of a pyramid or spiraling effect, right? Which suggests that we're not through the worst, that the worst might actually be coming in the next few weeks and months as we're looking at this. I want to turn back to Tamila and ask you specifically about the consequences of grain looting. We talked about how it's being done, but I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more in terms of the consequences for the region, for Ukraine and beyond, whether that has an impact on food prices, whether that has a direct impact to your assessment on the Ukrainian economy, which under war conditions is already in a dire shape and very vulnerable, and how you see this evolving, whether you believe that there can be a solution found in negotiations or in a different format this year to solve this problem and to prevent it. The situation is complicated as we then turn back our conversation to the Middle East and how many countries and frankly citizens are viewing this in terms of, at some point when it comes to famine, we don't care where the wheat is coming from, we need to not starve. Tell us a little bit about how you assess the situation in terms of consequences economically and socially for Ukraine and beyond.
Thank you for the question. Actually, all of us must understand that in Ukraine we also have a very bad economic situation, yes? And actually Russian Federation use hunger as a weapon in the southern part of Ukraine also, where we have a fighting now in Zaporizhia, in Kherson region, and many people don't have also any products in cities in the Kherson region which are blocked now because war, because full-scale invasion. And all of us, and I hope all of us understand that the main reason why we have this food crisis in the world, it's because it's a war and full-scale invasion against Ukraine. And of course, our government, our Ukrainian farmers, ready to fulfill our obligations for our partners. But now we don't have possibility to transfer our grain because it's stolen by Russian. Our seaports are blocked by Russian ships, actually. And of course, Maria has mentioned it, and you also. Now we have these negotiations from 4 sides, Russia, Ukraine, UN, and Turkey. Of course, we hope to have some decision after these negotiations. But of course, we always understand when this negotiation started, they do these missile strikes against Ukraine. Even yesterday in Vinnytsia. And many people is dying. And when we talking about food crisis, it's one of the side of a war, because on the one hand, our people is dying, our people is displaced. We have more than 12 million of people who displaced inside Ukraine and outside, yes, abroad. We have millions actually of people, 1,700,000 of people who don't have houses or apartments where they can return after this war is stopped. And of course, we don't have really happy news, unfortunately, and we understand that we must stop this war. And all negotiations, all sanction pressures against Russia is and more actually weapon from our partners. We hope it's
it will solve the problem.
Thank you. Solve the problem. And our one of our main requests for our partners, even we work with Maria in human rights sphere, and when we talking with our partners, we always say arming, sanctions against Russia, and only after that, after this war is hot period of war is finished, we understand we maybe solved problems with food security. But of course, we understand it's really not a good situation for our partners in the Middle East. Of course, we understand it. But a main reason and who does this crime for Middle East and for Ukraine, it's Russia.
If I may add some figures to support what Tamila was saying. Actually, as for the effects on Ukrainian economy, the agricultural and food sector represents almost 10% of Ukrainian GDP. It's in general. But when it comes precisely to this current situation, the invasion, this new wave of invasion, caused damages to the specifically agricultural sector to Ukraine in the total amount of $4.21 billion specifically. And as for the losses for the agricultural, Ukraine lost about 20% of sown area this year. So the figures are huge, I think. And it's important to underline here that Russia violates the international humanitarian law, because as an occupying power in the southern Ukraine, they have no right to extract the foods, because it's again, violation of international humanitarian law. But here we are talking about, and of course, it's a blackmailing. It's obviously a blackmailing of Ukraine, of the world, but it's like on the larger picture. But when we're talking about the situation in the field, we have like plenty of colleagues who fled from the occupied territories in Kherson region to government-controlled areas, or those people who stay in the occupation of our colleagues, like parents of our colleague who is here with us on this advocacy trip, they stay in the occupation. And on this like very level of like personal experience, one of the first problems that people faced in the occupation is just the lack of food. I mean, they cannot buy food, they have no cash because they have no access, to this banking system. Of course, it's like on this level, it's also an awful experience. After some time, food appears in the stores, but it's the prices just skyrocket 3 times more, and the quality of food is worse. This food comes from Russian Federation mostly. So so on both, this like larger picture with the Ukrainian economy is bad, but also on this very low level is also bad,
And can I ask a follow-up question just to draw the conversation a little bit broader? We had several kind of questions on that. One being from Gianna, whether you can assess, let's put it that way. First part of the question from me, and then the second one from our audience, whether you can comment on the support that particularly the United States has offered when it comes to these issues of human rights violations in the context of the food crisis. What more can be done, but also whether you have already data or conversations within Kyiv and beyond on the impact of this food crisis on partners of Ukraine, such as the United States. We know that here we're fortunate to have a separate continent with oceans and big distances in between, and our own production of agricultural products. But nevertheless, we already see consequences globally when it comes to inflation, etc. So can you give us an overview of the relationship on these issues of the food crisis with the United States?
I think I cannot, unfortunately, as I'm not like an expert in economics, but it's for us here, as we are here with our advocacy kind of mission, we indeed discuss the issue of arming, which has like direct relation to the possibility of Ukraine to restore our control over the territory and fulfill our obligation to deblocate the seaports and to provide this food. So I would say that this one, and yesterday the Congress voted for another bill that supports Ukraine even more. I believe this support would be dedicated to several directions, not only the military support, but also humanitarian support. And lots of the US agencies are dealing with this support, like USAID and others. So yes, I think that it's, and also when we're talking about the what more needs to be done, it's also Ukraine defines also this behavior of Russian Federation in terms of foods because, you know, when we are talking about this, I mean, if you look into the field, you can see also stuff like farmers being kidnapped even, you know, in order to provide their foods to the occupying forces. The agricultural techniques is being destroyed. So it's like very, I would say terrorist style behavior.
Sounds like Stalin.
Exactly, yes. Therefore Ukrainian MFA calls it food terrorism. Aside of these terrorists in their kind of spirit attacks on Ukrainian cities, we have just recalled Vinnytsia, but before that we had Chasiv Yar, up to 50 people were killed in this attack that targeted civilians. Before that we had Kremenchuk also. So we also call on the US government, specifically Department of State, and within our meetings with the Department of State, with the members of Congress and Congress staffers, with the other US agencies, we called on designating the Russian Federation as the state sponsor of terrorism, and also designating all of the Russian banks, because only some of them, few of them are actually now targeted by the US sanctions. So it's just a bit answers to your question on what can be done specifically by the US, but it's like a larger picture. It covers a larger picture, not specifically, of course, this food crisis was very specific, which is a very specific issue, obviously.
Let me turn to you, Murat. There's already like a series of questions in the chat and from me, but I'll start with two. First of all, I kept promising that can you, and you mentioned that as well, that Egypt is a luckier case compared to other countries in the region. And I think as we're looking at the impact of the food crisis on the worst parts of the impact, I think it's Syria and Yemen. But there's more to it. Can you give us it's superficial, it's short, but can you give us an overview in terms of your assessment of the impact of this food crisis, particularly when we focus on grain, when we're looking at countries in the larger Middle East region?
So I think I would only be able to do it superficially, but superficially, it's not just the Middle East, it's the Middle East and huge chunks of Africa. Because you mentioned Syria and Yemen. Syria and Yemen have already been embroiled in years-long conflict. So the situation was bad to start off with. It's worse now. And I mean, I've read analysis where people say, well, the governments have to provide. I'm not sure which governments they're referring to, because most of these countries are poor. Okay, it's not just Syria, it's not just Yemen. Lebanon is in a huge mess. I mean, I think by the end of April, food prices in Lebanon had shot up about 1,000%.
Yes.
I don't. I mean, for comparison, and this is a rough comparison, but in the States, you will have noticed food prices going up practically month by month when you go to the supermarket, okay? But, you know, it's about 9%. So, you know, feel free to compare it, okay? And this is a generally wealthy country. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Obviously, there are plenty of people in this country that are very, very poor, but generally speaking, this is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So Syria, Yemen, but then if you look at Africa, Mali, Somalia, Ethiopia, these countries I mean, they've already been hit by famine, okay? They've been hit by the Horn of Africa is, you know, facing its worst drought in, I cannot remember how long, a terrible drought. So you've got famine, you've got drought, but you also have climate change. And this is, I think, something people don't take care of. Climate change means that we've had several extreme weather incidents already this year. I mean, in Egypt, for example, you had 2 separate lots of harvests that were completely blighted. And again, Egypt is an agrarian country. So if you look at other countries that have even less, you know, so war, famine, drought, extreme weather. I mean, the situation is not great. And the longer this war spins out, the worse it's going to get, because these countries need to be provided with aid, okay? But I think there has been a tendency to say, well, no one knows how long this is going on, so we're not sure how much money we're going to put into this. So it's been difficult to get the appropriate aid for countries.
And then let me ask you two connected follow-up questions. On the one hand, we have President Joe Biden visiting the Middle East. Whether you assess that this visit will address and look at possible solutions for the food crisis. The Middle East Institute has issued a report, when was the beginning of this week, looking particularly at the visit to Riyadh. We've all been contributing to that, so maybe you can give us an overview from your perspective of whether that's being covered. And then the second part, kind of the second question from John Team, is if there is any onus on Gulf capital groups who own assets to forgo profits to alleviate this dire situation in the context of the relationship to Egypt. We know that Egypt has asked for help from Saudi Arabia to overcome the food crisis. And I think this is referring to that. He mentions that in the case of Egypt, how has the privatization of food processing following IMF SAP programs and subsequent purchases by Gulf capital groups exacerbated the issue of protein availability for impoverished Egyptians? Maybe you can draw it in a larger context to enlighten us on what this all means.
Yeah, so that last question, there's a lot going on, and is drawing a lot of parallels between different things that are actually quite difficult to match up. The first part of the question, President Biden's visit to the US. So my understanding is that the State Department feels that this visit is mostly to do with, it doesn't say anything about repairing relations, but that's obviously on the table, but it's sort of specifically to shore up security, and I believe it was to show, I believe I quote, a rock solid dedication to Israel's security. My take on it actually is that Israel's security is just fine, thank you very much, because the Arab, I mean, there are no Arab countries that are going to attack Israel anytime soon. That scenario was lifted when Egypt made peace in 1978, so that's not happening. I don't expect food security to, I mean, I'm sure some of the countries, certainly Egypt, would, want to discuss it, but I don't think that that is big on President Biden's, it's not high on President Biden's list, I'm guessing.
Priorities.
In anything, yes, in anything other than a general, we certainly don't want people to starve in the region because it's a small world, and before it was sort of all right to think that if it was, I know, poor people dying somewhere else in the world, it wouldn't matter too much. And I think we've all realized that the world is just too small nowadays. So I don't expect an enormous amount to come out of that. Now, Saudi Arabian help to Egypt. You want to bear in mind, this stuff is, there has been an influx of Gulf money in general to Egypt. This is not aid, these are investments. These are investment or loans, and therefore it's a quid pro quo. All right, it's not loans.
Not a gift, yeah.
No, it's not a gift. These are investments, which is great. The Egyptian government wants investments, but with that, of course, you have to worry about other things. So that is investment. With Saudis buying up, I mean, as we mentioned, 29.6% of Egypt's population is below the poverty line. They have always had difficulty accessing meat, as we mentioned earlier. There are many Saudi food companies already operating in Egypt, and generally speaking, the food that they produce is for a specific class of Egyptians. You're not hitting that 29.6%. That 29.6% is being catered to by the government. So there isn't a huge overlap there. All right, that's not where the problem is coming in now.
All right, thank you. And then we only have a few minutes left, so I want to get one more question in from the audience and then a very quick wrap up of the conversation. This is a question for either Tamila or Maria. Aside from the blockade in place of Ukraine's southern coast, is there precedent for Russian forces targeting port infrastructure? And then part two, is there a sense of whether or not Odessa is a particular objective of Russian forces at this point? I know you come from the human rights perspective. I can weigh in on that on the security and defense side, but I would love to hear from you in terms of your perspectives on these issues.
Russia mostly target actually when it comes to like our topic, not the seaports, but the infrastructure related to agricultural sphere. So again, burning like the harvest, stealing the agricultural techniques. Actually, they're stealing everything, but it also relates, including, sorry, like some, okay, I won't say, but they're stealing like underwear, you know, in the northern Ukraine. So of course, they're stealing all the things that they can use like at home, including some agricultural vehicles, etc., etc. Yes, and sorry, can you once again repeat the question, because I think
yes, when it comes to the blockade, is there precedent for Russian forces targeting port infrastructure? And is there a sense of whether or not Odessa is a particular objective?
Okay, so, and we have seen some attacks on Odessa as well. And it might be, again, I think, targeted by the rockets. But I can also say that in terms of this human dimension, people do stay in Odessa, they don't flee. And moreover, we can see the splash of the solidarity with the occupied Ukrainian territories, other Ukrainian territories. People in Odessa really try to support those people who, like compatriots that remain in Kherson region, in Zaporizhia region, in Mykolaiv region, that are under the occupation. So therefore, is there a threat? Yes, obviously there's a threat, but does it mean that people are going to give up? No, it doesn't mean.
But if I may, we must balance. We must find a road for our Ukrainian brain and balance with our security, because we understand that, of course, they targeted Odessa, and if we demine our seaports near Odessa, we understand that Russians could be used this territory when we maybe elaborate green corridors for humanitarians and food can be used for attack.
For an amphibious landing.
And yes, and we understand it, of course, and we must do check and balance for this issue.
So a lot to look forward to, also to be cautious about. Maybe the last word before we wrap up to you, Miret, with a broad question of what the most important challenges as we're looking at the food crisis and the consequences to the Middle East. What are the issues that you're most concerned about as we're looking into the next few months?
So I think the biggest concern is this spinning out. That's, I mean, that's, you know, because everything that we have discussed, it is just going to get worse as time gets along. So I think everyone's biggest concern is that this continues to spin out for a long time. So
this year and next.
So if we go into next, I think things are going to get extremely bad. So I'm really rooting for the Turks here. I sincerely hope they manage to get something off.
All right, let's all root together for the Turks with the big asterisks of skepticism that I've heard from all of you and that I share in terms of what can be done in the face of this very difficult situation that impacts not just Ukraine, most importantly, immediately, the Black Sea region at large, but also the Middle East, beyond into Africa and many other places. I want to thank, first of all, the audience for your amazing questions. I've tried to get in as many as I could. I'm sorry we didn't get the last minute ones in, though they were great. So thank you for joining in and listening to us. I hope this was useful to you as you're looking at the consequences of the food crisis worldwide. I'm glad, in a way, the silver lining of this, that this is another topic where the Middle East Institute excels, because we managed to connect the Black Sea region to the Middle East, though the connections right now are terrible, but it's important to broaden and deepen our understanding of these things. A big thank you to our distinguished panelists for participating. It's amazing to have you here. Tamila and Maria saw each other just a few weeks ago back in Ukraine, so it's great to reverse the pleasure. Thank you for joining us here. And last but certainly not least, Miret, this is, I think, the first panel we do together, so
Yes.
it's fantastic to be working face-to-face directly with you in this new hybrid format that we have at the Middle East Institute. So thank you all. Please be sure to check out our products at the Middle East Institute, including the report that we covered based on the question on President Biden's trip to the Middle East. And tune in for our next events. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.